I was at this point in my life where I wanted to do something different than what I'd always done. And I'm like, I really want to follow through on this. I really want to do this for me and see where it went. So I started writing the book.
This is A Joyful Rebellion, the podcast that explores that moment you realize the life and success you worked so hard to create didn't come with all the fulfillment you thought it would. I'm your host, James Walters, and I want you to be the author of your own story. Each week, I connect with people who inspire bold answers to the question, what do I do now to create a life I love? If you're ready to start answering that question for yourself, you're in the right place. So let's start a joyful rebellion. Rodney, Carpentier, thank you for being on A Joyful Rebellion today.
Glad to be here, James.
I talked to a lot of people who have written books, and it's cool to hear all the different stories of what got them to do that. And yours is particularly fascinating to me because you've been in a career for nearly 2 decades. Now you've been in law enforcement, and you had decided to take everything that you know, everything that you've experienced. Man, you must have thousands of stories of all the people that you've interacted with over those years. And you decided to start creating a book series. And the first of your series is out, and it's called Our Lady of the Overlook. It's written under your name, R.L. Carpentier. I want to know a little bit about what part of your career did you start thinking to yourself, you know what? I got some stories. I could probably start putting this down.
Really, the impetus of this, I never started out wanting to get into law enforcement. I kind of fell into it, I guess. I went to college and I studied English, and I read, all the classics. I really got into The Lost Generation, Hemingway and Faulkner and F. Scott Fitzgerald. I really wanted to be that kind of a writer. So I didn't really read anything that was popular. And then when I fell into law enforcement, that kind of fell away. And I got focused on doing the best I could in my early part of my career. I was married. We eventually started a family. So writing kind of got away from me for a little bit. Then it all began in May of 2022. I've worked all 3 shifts in my career. And at this time, I'm a first line supervisor. And I was working a double going from the afternoon shift into the midnight shift. Yeah. And it was about 2:00 in the morning. If anybody's ever worked shift work or just been up really late, there's a point in that where you start kind of hallucinating a little bit, when you've been up for a very long time. I remember being in the squad room and, even the radio was quiet. And this thought just came to my head. And the initial log line of Our Lady of the Overlook was, what if you were, you grew up and you knew you were adopted and you grew up with your adoptive parents and everything was fine. And what if you did that and you found out that birth mother was actually the victim of a cold case homicide? Nobody knows who she is. Nobody knows who killed her. And that was kind of the question that started Our Lady of the Overlook.
That's pretty cool. It's a really cool concept. So that's how the story begins.
Correct. However, I tried to write when I was in college and when I was younger, and I never really knew how to write. I had a million ideas that started out and fizzled, or I didn't know where to bring it after a certain point. So I kind of got determined at this point in my life that I was going to do this. It was kind of a weird crossroads. My father had passed away about a month earlier. I was just kind of at this point in my life where I wanted to do something different than what I'd always done. And I'm like, I really want to follow through on this. I really want to do this for me and do this, see where it went. And so when I started writing the book, that night, right after I came up with the idea to keep myself awake and keep myself a little bit more lucid, I started creating new characters and I started mapping them out and drawing them out a little bit. And what I like to do is just kind of start writing something. But while I wanted to start with the character who was going to find all this stuff out, I find myself kind of drawn more towards the law enforcement that was going to be on the receiving end of all this information and how they were going to react. So what I started doing is I actually created 2 characters. One was the woman who was going to find out the deep, dark secrets about her past, and also the police officer who was just going to get kind of drawn into this. And I started kind of mapping it up parallel for a long time, and I'm writing and going back to all my college books that I never read when I was in college and actually read them for the first time. All the craft books. I didn't take a lot of craft when I was in college, but I did.
Yeah.
I did take a couple of creative writing classes. I took a screenplay writing class. So I kind of understood, the hero's journey. There's a million books that I had on my shelf. So I started ripping them open and I'm like, okay, this is how I have to write. This is how I want to get this done. I'm going to follow these rules. The more and more I was writing, the two parallel characters, it was just getting too convoluted. So instead of two parallel characters that were going to meet in the middle, I concentrated on the police officer. I brought her in the middle. That's how the story ended up going. And when it came to craft, I started listening to overnight radio when I was working midnights, whatever was on, because I couldn't listen to classic rock anymore. There's a certain point where you hear Led Zeppelin for the sixth night in a row and you're like, okay, what else am I going to listen to? So I started finding it in our sports talk radio, but I live in the greater New York area. So there's only so many people I could listen to cry about the Jets and the Giants and the Yankees and the Mets after a while. So I switched over. I found a couple of overnight radio shows and it led into podcasts, which was also behind why I came up with this idea. I used to listen to a lot of true crime podcasts. And if you read the book, one of the characters that's kind of the catalyst of the story is a true crime podcaster. So I'm like, well, if they have podcasts for all these other things, there's got to be a podcast out there that can teach me how to write the right way. So I found a ton of podcasts and then YouTube channels, and I just took in as much as I could. And I found a system called Save the Cat, which is a screenplay writing system where they have certain beats and certain things. And they dissected so many different books and movies using this. I'm like, this is it. Now I can map this story out. I can say where I want to go, but also accomplish the things I need to move the story forward. And, in the end, that's how the book actually went and was born.
That's a really cool tale because it sounded like that's where you really began your journey. You went to school for English. You wanted to be a writer. You were fascinated with the stories that you had read, and that's what you thought you were going to do. And then life happens and you found yourself in a different career, but you're in the middle of a career and you've got all of this stuff to work with because of the experiences that you've had. This whole podcast is called A Joyful Rebellion because it's about that time in someone's life where they have checked all the boxes. They've done a lot in their life. They've been responsible with their career and maybe have a family. And then they look around and they think to themselves, like, hey, there's got to be more than this. I want to express my creative side. I've done the hard work. I've done a lot of what society's told me to do, did what my parents told me to do, did what I thought I was supposed to do culturally, whatever the situation is. And the rebellion part comes when you have to decide, like you just vocalize, like, I've got to do this for me.
Yeah.
And when you really start to own that, what was the point that got you saying, I've got to do this for me? Because anyone listening to this right now, a lot of people have wanted to write a book. I get that all the time. They're like, oh yeah, I've got this idea. And then maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't. But what was that thing that really got you putting pen to paper?
It was really a crossroads in my life at that point. With my father passing, my mom had passed 8 years prior to that. So I didn't have my parents anymore. And I felt I was just running from one thing to the other. And nothing was under my control to a degree. I've been working since I was 15 or 16 years old. I've been being told where to be and when to be there and how to dress and what to be prepared for nigh on 30 years, which is, typical life. But once you have a family now, you're running to pick up your kids and you're bringing them to this thing or to that thing, or your wife needs you to do this, or you're thinking ahead, like, let me stop and get this and all that stuff. And nothing at that point was really under my control or for me. And when I had this idea, it was something that I felt I really owned for the first time in a long time. Yeah, I've always been very creative. I'm a musician and I like writing songs and playing songs, but that's a much different thing that involves getting out in front of people. Whereas when I had this writing idea, I'm like, well, I could write a book and you're pretty much, you can be faceless. I mean, you could put anybody's picture on the cover. Nobody cares. I can make up a completely different name. A lot of famous writers or popular books are completely pen names, and you don't need to be out there as much. As long as the book's good, people will buy it. Whereas music's a very different kind of industry. So when I had this idea, I really wanted to push it forward. And it was just really gathering the tools in order to be able to do that, like I described with the podcasts. And once I had a plan It was, let's get it done. So it
Mhm.
was approximately a year ago that I actually finished the first draft. Then I didn't know what to do with it. It was, the dog catching the car finally. It was like, okay, now what do I do? And, I had taught I'd been learning the craft. Now I needed to learn the business and how to practically accomplish what I wanted to accomplish. So I revised, and then I revised again. And for good measure, I revised for the third time. And then I was like, okay, now what do I do? I wasted like 3 more months. And finally, I found one of those professional sites where you can find pickup workers and things like that. So I was able to hire an editor, and she took what I had, and we start getting all that imposter syndrome. Someone's actually going to read this. And she had such positive feedback from me that I didn't feel as bad. And I was like, well, I want to switch this scene and this scene, or I don't think this. She goes, no, it's fine. And as soon as she said that, it kind of gave me that confidence. Like, I don't have to do as much as I thought I had to do in order to, it really was okay. And I started just checking the boxes, and I'm like, oh, I need a cover. So I found a cover designer on the same website. Then I needed to have it proofread to make sure I didn't make any grammar or punctuation mistakes. So I got all that done, and I found myself last August with what I thought was my finished manuscript, but I needed that last bit of confidence, and I didn't know where I was going to get it from. So as things happen, my wife and my daughter traveled internationally last August. So I kind of was a bachelor for about 2 weeks, and I decided I was going to go to my first writers conference. So I went to the Killer Nashville conference. I met a ton of wonderful people. I took all the business courses. I didn't take a single craft course. Everything was, how do you do taxes? How do you present yourself as a writer? How to get on podcasts? How to record audiobooks, like all the business stuff. So while I was sitting there at the conference, I decided I was going to release the book at the end of October. And after I made that decision, it was, all right, let's do this. So
Yeah.
I bought formatting software, I formatted it, and I sent it to Amazon, and I said, all right, do the thing. And
Yeah. Push the go button.
yeah, so released it on October 29th, and I've just been trying to learn what the next steps are, because I have 3.5 years. I can retire in September of 2028 with my pension. And I would really like to have a good platform at that point where entrepreneurial wise, I'm making some money, I'm having a good time, I'm doing things, and I can work for myself.
That's a great plan. I mean, you're being creative, but you're also taking what you've been doing day in and day out for years and years. You know it like the back of your hand. So who better to fold that into a story and yourself, because you've got all the material, you know how these things go. You can tell it from a realistic standpoint. You're not an author having to look up, okay, what's the word if, what's the word in court if,
Yeah.
this person does that. So you're able to really bring the reader behind the curtain a little bit more, which is fascinating. But I want to talk just for a second. I want to almost not quite back up, but you've mentioned a couple of things that I love. And that is, you went to school for English. You went to school because you wanted to become a writer. And then you learned all of those things. Then you went into another career. But when you really got this sense that you wanted to own writing this story, and that was the one thing that you had total control over, then you started that research phase. And you started, okay, how am I going to structure this? You found a couple of different models. You found the Save the Cat structure that gave you some more confidence on how to build this story. And then you had the story, you looked at it, and you revised it several times before you started going outside and looking for other people. So now you weren't just relying on yourself and your own research. Now you're like, I've done the work. Now I need to bring some experts in on this. I find that that's really a genius process, because you do a lot of the research, you do the work, you fumble around, you have that imposter syndrome. You're like, I don't know if this is any good. I don't know if I did it right. And then you hold your breath while you hand it over to someone, and you're like, man, this could suck. Then they're like, okay, well, this is pretty good. Let's make a couple of changes. And you're like, wait, what? That wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. And that gets you to the next phase where you're not just thinking about the creative part anymore. You're not thinking about the craft and the structure. You're thinking about, okay, if it is good, and if I did create something amazing, let's figure out how to get people to enjoy it. because people don't know about it yet.
Right.
And so then you took the next step and you went to an even bigger community. You went to a writers conference. So tell me a little bit about your experience with those different phases of the process.
It's one of those self-motivating things. You have to push yourself and you have to be ready for the rejection. Not to be overly confident, but I've always been a good writer. Going all the way back to elementary school, I've always kind of been just a hair more talented than normal people. I could see things and I could put things down in a certain order. So I kind of had that raw talent there. Again, without having the team in your corner, you don't know how much of that raw talent can be mined. I started with a lot of raw talent and a lot of pushing from, my parents to go to college. So, that's certainly one phase. I think there's an important phase in there too, where, because I'm on a lot of groups online and there's a lot of young folks that are trying to be writers and they're trying to come up with all these ideas and they have wonderful, great ideas, but they don't have that life experience. When I tried to write when I was in college, I was overconfident and I was also very snobbish. Like I said, well, if it's not Hemingway, it's not worth reading. If I can't write like Hemingway, it's not worth writing. I had really, really great professors that showed how these people were able to harness their talent and push these things forward. But the major thing that Hemingway had that I didn't have was I wasn't an ambulance driver in World War I. And I wasn't a high society rich boy like F. Scott Fitzgerald. And I wasn't living in Paris. I didn't have all those experiences. I was just a normal kid from rural New York who went to college and I had a girlfriend. I went to school every day. I didn't have all these other things. And I had a lot of ideas that hadn't really been established just yet. So when I kind of fell into law enforcement, I just watched people and I listened to situations. That 18 and a half years was vital. I'm not saying everybody has to spend 18 and a half years, but I think at that point in 2022, when I came up with a new, unique idea, and it wasn't something that was going to be artistic and at the Lost Generation level. It was just going to be a genre novel about crime and thrillers and things like that. I kind of let go of that armor of I need to be at this high level. So that was an important phase. And then you have to know what you're doing. And the key phase at learning the craft and understanding it. I'm a huge fan of movies and well acted and well produced things. And I knew the things that I liked in a movie. And once that saved the cat, it unlocked something in my brain and gave me the steps. Once something had a steps and a process, it made it a lot easier also. So that phase of taking a raw talent, taking some experience and some real life background and applying the tool to it to make it all make sense led into this phase last year where I was just kind of lost and had something, didn't have the confidence to put it out there, and really was like, maybe it's not now or never, but you have something and you can sit on it for the next 10 years or, see if you have what it takes. And if you do, you might make some money. You may not make any money at all. At least you're going to have some fun along the way.
Yeah. And I know this from experience. It's not about the money. It's not even about the experience. It's just about, I need to do this to prove to myself I can do this.
Oh, that's a huge part of it too.
Yeah.
Years ago, when I first started college, I never thought I would be where I am right now. And, like we keep talking about with really taking something on for yourself. My wife's never read the book. She sees it around, but she's not a huge reader. I've read some parts to my daughter and she's okay with it. She's turning into a reader. But I don't have a lot of, it's like I have a lot of people that are pushing me. You have to do this. It's really self-motivated at this point.
What age is your daughter?
She's 11.
So yeah, that's a great age to start becoming a reader and diving into other worlds and exploring that side of things.
It's really fun because I'm meeting some other authors that aren't necessarily in the mystery genre and they're writing a lot of stuff for her age. And I'm like, oh, well, let me know when your book comes out. I'll get it for my daughter. So she can be on the ground level of the next Harry Potter. That'd be great.
Talking about Harry Potter, that's a series, and Our Lady of the Overlook is the first of a trilogy, right?
Correct. Yep.
Did you plan it that way to begin with, or did you get halfway through the story and think, you know what, this is going to be too much for just one book. I need to split this up.
I had a feeling it would become bigger because once I stopped focusing on the two characters meeting and having a resolution to that, and I started adding more layers to the story. Not only is there the cold case that we're concerned about as the reader, there's a modern day murder that's mixed up in there too. And this rookie police officer that has no skills and has no experience is now kind of trying to figure this whole thing out. I figured, trilogies are always, that's what we grew up with. Back to the Future was a trilogy. Indiana Jones was originally a trilogy. It's only years later that they kind of messed with that formula. The original Star Wars is trilogy. And so there's a natural pattern to those. Big fan of Scream. So, all the rules of the original, the sequel, and then if it's a trilogy. So I started kind of planning it that way. And I wanted a lot of the red herrings and the things that you believe from the first book to get turned on its head by the last one. So I am currently taking a break right now from editing the second book. I finished the manuscript back in December, and I have 15 days to get it to my new editor, kind of under the gun, which actually pressure I found is another phase for me. But now that I have either self-imposed or other deadlines, it kind of pushes me a little bit more to put the importance in there. That book ends, kind of has maybe not a Darth Vader twist, like, I'm your father, and kind of ends on that low, oh man, where do we go from here? And that's really what I wanted to put in, because the third one is going to just be, once I write it, is just going to be this, I want it to be almost bombshell after bombshell. At the end of each act, you find something out like, wait a minute, I thought this. Nope, short of, soap opera twins or things like that. I like being grounded in the reality. My characters are small town police officers. They're not in a big city where they have a ton of resources and all these things. They have them and the guy next to them, and they really have to rely on one another. That's kind of where I want things to go. I don't want some kind of deus ex machina that's going to come out of nowhere. So very grounded, but also very, didn't see that coming. That's that's what I really want out of the third one. Once we get to the third book, and people that have been following me or come along later and they get to the end of their book, they're like, wow, that really blew my mind. Yeah, maybe book one was a little slow, but things got cool in book two, and book three, you have to read all three, because what you believe from page one is not what you're going to believe on, the last page of the book. So that's my goal. So that's why I'm kind of focused on a trilogy right now. So I really want to get to the end of the trilogy so I can get on to whatever the next project is.
I know that feeling, because I'm working on a book right now that is the one that I'm like, I've just got to get this one out of the way. There's stuff I would rather be working on, but until I get this one out of the way, it's just going to itch at me, and it's got to get done. So I'm in the throes of that, and in the hard part of writing narratives around some of the things. But you're talking about your stories are set in small town in the mountains.
Yes.
And characters who are fictional characters, but they're based on real people. So I'm curious if some of your coworkers have read the book and they're like, hey, is that me?
Yeah.
Does that happen?
Yes. Not so much is it me, but is it this person? Everybody assumes that the main character, his name's Mike. Everybody assumes he's me. I'm like, no, he's not me. He's 24 years old. I'm in my 40s. I say, he can't be me. But a lot of the things that he's going through were things I remember from being a rookie, from being a brand new person, or same way observing new officers now that I'm, that are on training, and seeing how they act and how tentative they can be, but also, maybe not reckless, but just get ahead of themselves. So that's kind of a more of a universal character. But the antagonist chief is based on a couple of guys I had throughout my career, and they were kind of negative forces in work life. They're five people on the outside, but it's just how they act at work. The two supporting characters that are kind of Mike's support are based on a couple of different guys I know. One of them being my original partner. He was an older kind of mentor guy for me. And the other one is kind of the ex-military, very disciplined, very together, very in shape. So they're kind of two different roles for him. The one I always like to pick out is there's a state police investigator that gets involved and is both very diminutive in size and a sharp dresser. That is based on two guys I worked with. One was a guy I worked with very early in my career. He was very brash, very smart. And the other one is this investigator I know that he'd wear a three-piece suit to the range.
Wow.
And they were both very together with their lives. So I kind of created this character based on those guys. In book two, there's a character that is a direct reflection of a person I know, but he's actually not a cop in the book. He's more of a side character, but my friend's retiring soon. So he's like, can you put me in the book? I'm like, Yeah, I'll put you in the book, Rich. But yeah, I do get a lot of that, or, some of the characters, people pick up on. One of the cool things, because I base it on this area, the Catskill Mountains we frequent, we do a lot of hiking. And I was doing an author event up in this area, and I did a reading of one of the inciting incident scene. And it describes how Mike's driving from one end of the town to the other to go to what's eventually going to be this crime scene, this murder scene. When I finished, I was talking to some of the people there, and the guy goes, "I know exactly where that road is. I was following you the whole way." I'm like, perfect. And that's the cool things I like to hear. Awesome. And then the one criticism I got from a friend of mine is again, it takes place in the Catskill Mountains, which is just south and west of the city of Albany, which is kind of where everybody originates, and then they end up in the mountains later on. So the action takes place up there. And I got back from Christmas break, and he walks in, he goes, "You had them go all the way to California, but you couldn't go to Albany?" I'm like, listen, I said, that's why you got to read book 2. They go to Albany in book 2. It's fun to have them kind of pick out little things like that, or little things that I've thought of and purposely, as long as it's intentional, or at least I say it's intentional.
For people who don't live there, for people who have never been there before, I'm sure they could still get the visual, but for someone who has walked down those streets, it's got to be super special. And I want to turn the conversation to something kind of practical, because another thing that you mentioned, and I've had experience with it myself, and it's a game changer when you're in the throes of trying to produce the book, not necessarily writing it, but you mentioned you went to a website where you're able to hire freelancers, essentially people who have great experience as editors, as cover designers, that kind of thing. When it came to financing that, I know myself, I created my first book about 11 years ago now, it's 2013. When I did that, I did a Kickstarter campaign. And the whole reason of doing that, I had everything written, but I needed to hire that editor. I needed to hire the proofreader and all the things you mentioned. How did you go about doing that? Did you set some money aside? Did you do any sort of campaign?
I did not do a funding campaign. I was fortunate enough to be able to utilize any overtime I made. I kind of took those funds and I just kind of put them aside, and I used that in order to get everything off the ground. I was just at another conference in Austin, Texas, specific to novel marketing. And one of the speakers there talked about Kickstarter, and she had a lot of great tips. But the first thing she said was, don't start a Kickstarter just because you sat through my 45-minute presentation. She goes, do some research beforehand. So I think this is the plan, because again, book 1, I had about a 6-week from announcement to release, which was way too short. But again, I was unknown. So I'm like, I just needed to get book out there. Nothing's going to sell book 2 like book 1. So now I'm really doing the 6-month book release thing. For book 3, I'm thinking of doing a Kickstarter and offering some cool things with, maybe like a box set for the trilogy, or doing things like that. So I need to do more research on Kickstarter before I get into that. And for me to kind of utilize some of my personal funds at this dream and kind of self-invest, I felt like I had a little bit more stake in it. Fortunately, we're in a financial situation where I could take, $1,000 here or $500 here in order to pay for some of these folks, as opposed to taking someone else's money and feeling kind of that responsibility.
Yeah.
Hey, this money came from this person who believes in me. I'd rather kind of put my own skin in the game first and say, hey, I put out 2 books, and if you really like them and you want to see the 3rd book, I need some help. I just signed on the same cover designer from the first one. She's super excited to work with me again. I am using a different editor only because this editor was my first choice, but she didn't have any availability until this year. So as soon as she emailed me in the fall and said, hey, I'm signing up for 2025. Can you do February? I was like, yep, I can do February. Yep.
Here we go.
I have 3,500 words written, but yes, I could be ready by February. Yeah.
Oh my God.
So talk about, like I said, self-imposed,
Nope.
And I kind of liked that the second book is a different experience than the first one. Like everything is new again. Whereas the first one, there was nothing pushing me except for myself. This one, I kind of have these outside forces moving me forward, and, I'm still not making enough to finance stuff myself. I'm still having to pull from my overtime, but I'm getting to the point where I think hopefully I can turn that page and move forward. Kickstarter in the fall.
You invested your own money and you are doing it again. So clearly it was worth the investment to get you where you are now. Now you see that this thing has legs, and now you've done this process once before, and you realize, okay, this was definitely worth the investment last time. I'm going to do it again. Then maybe next time you can do it bigger and better. With book 3, maybe the launch is a little bit different, or maybe other things besides you're probably going to have the same editor, cover person, that sort of thing. But you can get creative when you do a Kickstarter campaign or whatever kind of campaign. That's just my only experiences with Kickstarter. But I'm curious when it comes to the actual, all the details in the book. Like I'll say I haven't read the book. I want to now. I'm going to go get a copy because I need to chill out with some fiction every once in a while. But as a current law enforcement, like, what's the line between what can you not talk about? What can you talk about? What obviously you can't. Well, I won't say obvious because I'm asking the question because I don't know. What can you talk about and not talk about?
I've read a lot of procedurals that go into exactly how the crime scene is done or the autopsy is done. I leave all the gory details out. There are some expletives in there, but nothing's really graphic. There are a couple of fight scenes, but there's no major violence that's in there. It's more of, when I talk about procedure, I talk about the little things that a police officer will do. The entire opening scene of the book is Mike pulling over a car and meeting a character, all the things he does and how he approaches the car and how he does things and the robotic nature of how you are when you're a rookie cop, and kind of humanize that person, because it's unnatural to take custody of somebody. When you make a vehicle stop, you're taking custody of somebody. You're infringing on their rights. And that's a great responsibility. And I take that very seriously. And I kind of want to put that out in the book. But later on, there's a use of force situation. And I want that to feel as real as it would if I were there. As a supervisor, I reviewed hundreds of uses of force, from grabbing somebody in a certain way and displays of weapons and things like that. And in this use of force situation, Mike has to use his taser. And I didn't want to have a situation where it felt fake. And I didn't want a cop to look at it and say, oh, that wouldn't happen that way. But that was really important for me.
That would be the last thing you want people scrutinizing it and saying, nah, that's not the way you do it, or whatever the case might be. But how long did it take you, once you got the editor? It sounds like you had some imposter syndrome handing that over. Then once you built up that confidence, knowing that, okay, you really had something here, but then you had to start the marketing piece of it. How long did it take to get over that part where you're like, now anybody can be reading it?
You know what? I haven't really worried about that.
Okay.
You talked about marketing. That was a huge thing to start, and I'm still completely learning those things. That's why I went to a conference specifically for marketing. But I really haven't thought about what other people think. I don't want to let it bother me. It's not that I don't care. One of the cool things they talked about at the novel marketing conference I went to was sometimes the best thing you can do is get your first 1-star review, and you post that, because it's kind of a badge of honor to get that 1-star. Because, if 2-star, 3-star, this was, it was ho-hum, it was okay, versus, and then people that are really great. But the guy that went out of his way to put that 1-star and to write something, it's worth it. The closest I've had to that was, I've been doing podcasts since November, trying to get on with as many people, learn how to interview. I met a lot of really cool people in that journey. But the first one I was ever on, I posted it on Facebook, and I was directing people there. And somebody made a comment on the video itself on YouTube, or it was on my actual post. And they said, "This is the stupidest effing thing I've ever seen." I was like, cool. It was a real badge of honor, because I'm sure some people went over to see how stupid it really was.
Yeah, that's incredible. This is the stupid. I can hear
great.
the accent when I'm hearing that. That's so good. What's the best way for people to connect if they want to get a copy of the book, if they want to hit up your website, see when things are scheduled to be coming out for the next in the series?
My website is RL Carpentier Writer. You can sign up for my mailing list. I do a newsletter at least once a week. I list all my events. I put all the podcast stuff on there, all the information that I have there. So rlcarpentierwriter.com. You can buy a personalized signed copy from there. If you're more inclined for the ebooks, I am on Amazon. You can also buy a print direct copy from that, but I try not to push people towards Jeff Bezos if I don't have to. Some people, like, I'm an audiobook guy, so I feel bad because I'll meet a lot of writers and I'm like, yeah, hey, do you have an audiobook? And if they do, I'll definitely check it out.
Yeah.
I'm on Facebook. I am on Patreon. That is a very new thing that I've been working on. So that's kind of under construction, but trying to get things going over there. So I'm all over the place, but the best place to get information is the newsletter. I don't inundate. I try to make it short and sweet, but newsletters are a great tool.
Thank you for that. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would like to leave with the listeners today?
Very quickly, because going back to that first podcast that I wrote about that the guy didn't like, that was more of a standard question. Like the guy asked the same questions to every guest. And one of the things was he talked about who I admired, and that got me thinking about my dad. And that got me thinking about this statement they used to say, it kind of became a family mantra, is early is on time is late is not acceptable. The more I kind of thought about it and spoke about it, it kind of became this thing of being prepared. And that's what I really feel this process has been for me. I kind of set that hard date that I was going to retire right on time at the 20 years, and I needed something to do. And I kind of said, well, if I have this idea, let's get ahead of it. And I feel like I'm early for creating this platform and creating this creative process, because a lot of the guys I know started looking at their second careers way too late, and they kind of wandered around for a little bit after their career was over. So that early is on time is late is not acceptable was a really key to the platform and the brand I'm building. I even have a coffee cup that I produced that I sell off of my website that just has that on there. So don't know where that's going to go just yet, but I think that's the last little part of my philosophy and journey from getting into being creative to where I am now.
I love that so much. And I've said that to my kids quite a bit. I teach every once in a while. I'll come on as an adjunct instructor in photography school. And I tell that to the students, and some don't understand it as much as others, but it is an amazing philosophy to incorporate into your life. So thank you for that. Rodney, thank you for being here on A Joyful Rebellion, and I will look forward to reading your book, Our Lady of the Overlook, and the forthcoming books after that.
Thank you very much, James. Take care.
Thanks for joining me today. If you've enjoyed this content and are thinking about ways to share your story or even get more joy out of your life, I have a free ebook that I'd love to share with you. It's called Plotting Your Joyful Rebellion, and I designed it to be a 5-step field guide full of guerrilla warfare tactics to help prepare you to overthrow any of the parts of your life you feel the call to rebel against. Go to ajoyfulrebellion.com and click on the link right there at the top to claim your free copy of the book. Again, that's ajoyfulrebellion.com, or simply hit the link at the top of the show notes. What sort of rebellion are you plotting right now? I'd love to hear about it. Connect with me on Facebook, Instagram, or through the website at ajoyfulrebellion.com. Thanks again for listening today, and be sure to stop by next week for another episode full of joyful rebellion.